And as we await a new executive order on immigration, it is a comment about some of those very refugees the president made this weekend that has stirred some new outrage. On Friday, Tucker Carlson tonight ran an interview with filmmaker Ami Horowitz about the alleged crime spike in Sweden after the nation took in hundreds of thousands of refugees over just the past few years.
They know that this crime is happening. They can feel it. The statistics are clear. But they would refer to what is the root cause behind it and say, oh, it's just more, it happened to be more violence. It's men who are raping people, not the refugees. They'll make excuses for it. The majority of the population in Sweden still want to have an open door policy. It's confounding.
On Saturday at his rally in Melbourne, Florida, President Trump referenced the reporting. Watch.
You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
Then on Sunday, the president clarified the meaning behind his statement, tweeting this: "My statement as to what's happening in Sweden was in reference to a story that was broadcast on Fox News concerning immigrants and Sweden." Well, this morning on Fox and Friends, Tucker spoke about the interview and the president's comments.
Presidents ought to be precise in what they say. There should be no question about what their meaning is, and that applies to this president, too, for sure. On the other hand, it seems like we may be missing the point of the story, which is there has been a massive social cost associated with the refugee policies and the immigration policies of Western Europe.
Here now is Matt Bennett, former deputy assistant to President Clinton, Dana Loesch, host of Dana on the Blaze TV, and Guy Benson, political editor at townhall.com and a Fox News contributor. I'm sure there's a very spirited discussion about to happen here because there are so many ways to look at this and what has happened. But Guy, one thing is for sure, the White House immediately came out and clarified the president was not referencing an attack that had happened the night before in Sweden. He was referencing crime in general in Sweden. He has not calmed his critics, however. Your response?
All right, so there's a couple moving parts here, Sandra, and I think we just heard that explanation from Tucker on Fox and Friends this morning. That was a really good one. Yes, President Trump was quite imprecise with his words, and when you're the president, words matter, facts matter, phrasing matters, and that's something that maybe the president can improve upon, let's put it that way. But what was the reaction among so many in the press? It was to invent a story that Trump's words were in reference to some sort of fake, non-existent terrorist attack, which is something that he never said. They inferred it, perhaps, but it seems like there's a problem here on both sides where Trump doesn't quite get it right, to put it mildly, on the details, and then the press reads something into it that he never said, and they run with it, and that's not accurate either. So I can imagine a lot of voters sitting back and saying, I don't know who to trust because it seems like a lot of people are behaving irresponsibly.
I mean, Matt, it does seem that they're not giving him any room here. Everything he said, it seems the press wants to ignore the point that he's making. Tucker Carlson made the very point. We're not getting to the real issue here. He is actually raising a very important point, one that is Sweden, and it's open borders. And is there anything that we can learn from the immigration policy that we've seen in other parts of Europe?
Well, that point was not at all clear from what the president said at that rally. But look, the bigger problem, Sandra, is that he says things that are obviously and provably false all the time. So you have the press kind of chasing him around.
Stick with this statement, though. What did he say that was false here?
Well, look, nothing in this exact sentence was false, and I'm not suggesting that it was. But one thing that is kind of disturbing, the president apparently is not a big fan of his intelligence briefings. He was tweeting about Nordstrom 20 minutes into one of the briefings last week. He should not be getting news about Europe from Fox News. We're getting off
subject here because there's obviously a problem that he's trying to bring up. Guy, I see you nodding your head. Let's talk about Sweden and the problem that's there.
Yes,
Dana, jump in here as well. Hundreds of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers in just the last few years. Top three countries of origin: Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Even one of their own people in Sweden one of their own researchers, I found this in a Swedish newspaper, warning that segregation and long-term unemployment of refugees could have a negative effect on crime rates in Sweden in the future. Why is nobody willing to discuss what is happening and what very quickly could be happening in some of these parts of the world?
You're absolutely right, Sandra. There's been an increase in no-go zones. I mean, Horowitz was discussing this. There's also, we've heard from a number of individuals who work with police in Sweden. They say that they're at a breaking point where it concerns crime. Look, it's irrelevant whether or not Trump's words were imprecise. I do agree with Guy that words matter. However, this is what the left does. They say, well, because Trump was imprecise with his arguments, with his statement, and there was no incident in Sweden last night, I guess there's no problem in Sweden. Guess they're not having an epidemic of rapes. Guess they're not having an epidemic in all of Europe with terror attacks right now because there is an influx of unvetted refugees. That is the problem. You can simultaneously, and I feel like I have to draw a picture for our brethren across the aisle to fully understand this, Sandra. There, you can simultaneously say, maybe he didn't say it perfectly the way that they would like, but also there is a serious problem going on in Sweden with refugee and crimes, and that's the reason the whole phrase rapugee came to exist. You can do both.
Yeah, and Matt, I want to get your reaction to that, but Guy, first I want to talk about this new EO, this new executive order that could be coming down any moment. We know some of the details that have been reported is that this targets the same 7 predominantly Muslim countries as the first order, but there are some changes to it. Is this draft going to see the same sort of resistance as the last one?
This is the draft, if the reporting is accurate. This is the order that should have been put out initially. It cleaned up a lot of the PR and policy messes that the first one created. Those were unforced errors. And I know a lot of people want to focus on those 7 countries. Those were pre-existing from a list that predated President Trump based on existing legislation. So I actually have read a fair amount of legal analysis that convinces me that the lower courts throwing out the initial order, even though I had problems with it, was bad law because the president has a lot of power under the Constitution and under statute on these matters. But now that they are honing this and fine-tuning it more carefully, which they should have done before they rolled it out initially, I think that it absolutely should pass constitutional muster, and I think is overall just better policy.
So Matt, let me bring this all full circle here, and let's look at what is happening over there. In your view, is there anything that we can learn from the immigration policy we have seen in Europe and the fallout there? Is there anything that we can learn from that and apply here?
Well, of course there is, and we've learned that lesson. Europe is physically attached to these war zones where the refugees are coming from, and they are coming either by boat or on foot, and they have hundreds of thousands of refugees flowing in without any sort of vetting or checking. By contrast, and this is contrary to what the president keeps saying, we have intense vetting of refugees, say, from Syria. It takes almost 2 years for a refugee to get into the country. This is totally unlike what's going on in Europe, and anyone who wants to draw comparisons between the two has to explain that this is an utterly different situation.
All right, Dana, last word to you.
Well, I think that as what Guy said, those 7 countries, those were drawn up in a list by former President Barack Obama. And I think it's smart to be able to slow down the process and be able to adequately vet who's coming into the country. An additional 90 days on top of 120 days does not a huge difference make. And I'm glad to see that something's finally being done and that people are starting to take this issue seriously. We don't want to end up like Europe, and this is a good first step.
All right. Guy, Dana, Matt, thanks to all 3 of you for being here.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.